Oh, see? And then there's the live thing.
Oh, neat.
I have waveforms. You have waveforms. We have waveforms. Who could
Who
ask
could
for
anything more?
I think it only works when we record.
Except, where did my notes go? They like vanished. I mean, I was ready. Apparently, I'm not. This is like a Misdirected Mark episode now.
Right now, really, this is our hot opening.
Sorry, everybody. Here we go. Well, welcome to Layers, Levels, and Arcs, GMing the Misdirected Mark way. My name is Chris Sneezak.
My name's Phil Vecchione.
And we do a lot of things out there, I guess, in tabletop gamings. Phil, you're a podcaster. Why don't you tell some people some of the podcasts around?
Sure, I'm one of the co-hosts of the Misdirected Mark podcast, along with Chris and Old Man Logan, and I am one of the co-hosts of Pandas Talking Games, along with my co-host Senda.
Mm-hmm. And I am the co-host, aside from the Misdirected Mark podcast, of Down with D&D with the Mad Wizard Sean Merwin, and the person who runs right now is the game master for the FM Gamers, our actual play live stream D&D game that is airing every other Monday from 7 to 9 p.m. on twitch.tv/misdirectedmark. We both write for the Gnome Stew.
Yes, we do.
And we also are owners of a publishing company.
Encoded Designs and Engine Publishing.
Yeah, the imprint now of Encoded Designs.
Correct.
So what we're doing tonight is we're talking about a couple of ideas that we have talked about before on the Misdirected Mark podcast. The idea of layers and the idea of arcs. We're going to spend about 20 to 25 minutes on each part, and by then we should be done. If there's any time left over, we'll take any questions from the live comments.
Yeah, we'll try really hard to leave a little time so that if people have questions, and along the way, if you want to leave comments, while we are broadcasting, we sometimes just pull them in. We're actually pretty comfortable with this. We do our show, the Misdirected Mark podcast, live streaming every Tuesday. So if you want to just throw them in, we're really good at just kind of working comments in while we're talking.
Mm-hmm. Right now, Elizabeth and River have said hi to us.
Yeah, hello.
Hi, River. It's good. I haven't talked to you in a while. I hope everything's going well for you. Live show stuff, right? So Phil, get us started.
Yeah, so cool. So these two topics are things that we've done in past episodes, and they're actually pretty old. Like for us, these are episodes we did a couple of years ago. And the first one is
more than a couple, friend. More than a couple.
Right. I know. I'm trying to do the quick math. That's like 3 years based on that math.
3.5.
So the first topic that we want to talk about is layers. So this is a topic that we did in episode 209, which you probably can find on the website.
I think it's
and what we mean by layers of the game is that when we're playing a game, we are interpreting what is going on in the game in very different contexts at different times during the game. So sometimes we are looking at things as our character. Sometimes we are viewing them as the player who's playing the character, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens in the game is kind of filtered by the context that we're in. And so like we see this a lot when if you are not focused at the character level and somebody's interacting with you, and then all of a sudden, you're like, oh yeah, right. And you have to kind of like switch gears to kind of get into your character and address the other player.
Happens a lot to me when I'm playing Fate, because I'm looking at all the aspects, not thinking about what my character's up to, just thinking about how the situation is evolving because of that.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, we're going to break those layers apart in just a second and talk about those. And we also develop preferences for certain contexts. We have comfortable places where our mind during the course of a game likes to reside. And that can be different per game. Like certain games, you may have a preference at different layers, depending on the type of game that you're playing, and then these contexts, they all get kind of layered upon each other, and we traverse these layers through play. Like we do this naturally. What we're going to describe here is kind of an artificial construct to some extent, so that we can kind of tease apart some of the pieces. But in truth, like this happens very organically while you're playing the game, and it's just kind of where your attention floats. And our first model for this, because I think we're going to refine it a little towards the end of this segment, our first model for this was like a layer, like layers, like starting at the bottom and kind of working your way up, right?
Like a cake.
Like a cake.
So let's look at those layers. We'll start from that bottom layer or what we call the bottom layer. It's not really the bottom layer, but for the purposes of our example.
Yep.
You're first, buddy.
Oh, sure, no problem. So the first one is the character layer, and this is when you're inside the character's mind, you're playing through the character's eyes. Right, so you are immersed into your character. You are dealing with questions like, what am I doing? What is it I want at this moment? What choice can I make now to move forward to achieve my goals? What's best for my character?
Uh-huh.
And the skill that really kind of governs this layer is immersion, right? So this is the skill of being immersed into your character and kind of using what you're hearing in the narrative, in the shared narrative space, to imagine what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And the tools that kind of help facilitate this is your character sheet. Will certainly give you some pointers about your character. Your character backstory.
That helps too.
Not that we're saying you have to write 10 pages of backstory, but any backstory that you've created is an aid to immersing your character.
3 paragraphs.
3 paragraphs, a bulleted list, that kind of thing. And the session 0 questions. So any questions that kind of came up in your session 0 about your character are also things that are going to kind of help build this layer.
Mm-hmm.
What's our next layer?
So then our next layer up for this example is the group. So this is, we're thinking about the group as a whole and how the group is doing and what they are doing. Those are the activities that kind of go along with that. And the questions that we kind of ask are, what are we doing? How is everyone around us doing? Are we achieving those group goals that we've set for ourselves? And like, what is best for the group? And our main skill or our goal that we're trying to achieve at this layer is teamwork. Mm-hmm. Hopefully. That's the idea. I mean, maybe not if you're not trying to achieve teamwork, then maybe the game isn't about being part of the group. That's just a thing to think about within game design. And the tools that we use and game choice, because this is about game mastering. So this is the things that the game master should be thinking about. We'll talk about that later. But the tools that we're using there are the group template. So if you have a group template, that's an old concept that I haven't really heard a lot of people talking about lately. Have you, Phil?
I haven't. I mean, it goes back to a Fear the Boot. Fear the Boot is the one who's credited for the group template.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that speaks to how long ago we wrote this, right?
Yeah, right. So,
but in essence, if people don't know what the group template is, part of the group template, and it was very much a session zero tool, but part of it was, why are we together?
Mm-hmm. And that's part of your session 0 constraints too, if you have them, right?
Yeah.
Whatever you came up with during your session 0. So let's talk about the next level up, Phil. It's all you.
Yeah, so traversing upward, right? We've gone from character, we go to group. Now we talk about the game, right? Mm-hmm. So now we're thinking about the mechanics of the game, bonuses, actions, etc.
All the
question, mechanisms, exactly. So the questions that now are populating our field of thought are: how does this mechanism work? Do I get a bonus if I do X? How do I do this thing that I want to do in the game? How do the mechanics impact, some of the other layers of play? And our skill, right? So our skills that dominate this level is rules mastery, right? So the more we know about the rules of a game, the more we can think through this layer and answer our own questions internally. Yep. And game flow, like how does the game, the pace of the game. And there's all sorts of things that kind of facilitate this, right? Our rule book is helpful.
Oh, very helpful.
Maps, minis, and dice. So if we're playing folks on the table or folks on the map kind of game, like we're doing a 5e with a map and figures, like those actually have meaning to us in the course of the game. APs and podcasts. So if we're listening to how games, like we've listened to how games are played, that helps us mechanically improve, as well as discussions about games, blogs, reviews, etc.
All that stuff.
Yep.
All right, let's talk about story now. That's the next level, or another level. So this is thinking about the flow and direction of the story that's being created at the table. Like, where is the story going? Will or how will this thing be revealed in the story? What is best for the immediate story? And we'll talk about the far-reaching story in a second. But the big goal here is about storytelling, and all these games that we play tend to be about storytelling. We're creating and telling stories, and the things that help us do that are our session notes, the meta mechanics of the game. Like that is a big thing that has come up in the last decade or so about games, like these meta mechanics that help push stories along, and player discussion. So like this is not character discussion. This is players, including the game master, talking about where they kind of want the story to go. Those things all really help. Those are all things that we do at the story level.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me about the campaign now.
Right. So, so next layer up, right, is now thinking about the greater story being told over the course of many sessions, right? So, are we getting closer to our campaign goal, right? Are we going to defeat Baron von Badass, you know, in the next sessions?
Another Fear the Boot reference.
Yeah, thank you. Where should we go next, right? Like maybe we're getting, and we're going to talk about arcs in a second, but maybe we're getting close to the end of an arc, and we're going to be presented with some decisions like, do we travel to the north to make a treaty, or do we head to the south to look for the artifact, right? Like those are now starting to be questions that we're thinking about at a campaign level. And you know, that question that we're really asking ourselves here is like, what is best for the overall story, not the story that we're playing tonight, but what's the overall story? What's best for that? And this is really a function of campaign management, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is just understanding how campaigns operate, and you know how to kind of keep a campaign moving. And so things like things that help with this are campaign notes. So sometimes if you know people have a shared Google Doc with campaign notes, wikis, those kinds of things. The meta mechanics, player discussions, right? This is all the things where you know now we're starting to have a conversation about, cool, we're wrapping up this arc. Which way do we want to go? Do we want to go north? Do we, you know, to make that treaty? Do we want to go south and look for the artifact first? What's the pros? What's the cons? That kind of thing.
Or
Hey,
if we're utilizing meta mechanics, like where are our alliances and favor in our Forged in the Dark game?
sure. I want to bring up one more level because you don't have it here.
Sure.
But there's one more level that is self, right? So at the self level, we are thinking about us as a player. And it could be questions like, when are we going to eat? What time is this going to wrap up? Because I have to get to work in the morning. When will there be a break so I can go to the bathroom, right? And these questions are kind of about our own, you know, our own body, our own self, and they, you know, can sometimes become a distraction, right? Because they may be like, we may be trying to be in the character layer, and now we're, you know, starting to wonder about like, when are we going to eat because we're starting to get hungry. There's no skill for this, right? So there's no skill, but this is just like, you know, kind of being aware of, you know, yourself, and just realizing that that is actually one of the places your mind goes during the course of play. Like, are you cold? Are you tired? Are you thirsty? You know, all of those things.
Yeah, and
So
if you can make that layer fade to the background as much as possible while you're actually in the middle of playing the game, that's good.
Yes, I mean, I'll say yes and no, right? Like, I think from a self-care perspective, like, I think if you're cold, you shouldn't ignore that, right? Like,
well, that's what I mean is like if it's chilly, then you dress warm so that you don't have to think about being chilly.
yeah. So, so I guess the skill that we're talking about here is preparedness, right?
Yes, that is one of them. Yeah.
Right. So if I know that I'm going over to the game after work, I might want to prepare by making sure I've eaten. Or if you know if the game's being hosted somewhere that doesn't have, you know, somebody providing beverages and stuff, did I bring my, you know, did I pick up a bottle of water on the way, you know, to the game?
Or
That
if
kind
I'm
of thing.
playing in Phil's cold ass basement in the middle of December, I want to make sure that I bring like some sort of warm clothing,
I
and
mean,
especially
really,
warm footwear.
I mean, really, in February, right? Like February, my cold ass basement is like frigid.
That's true.
And it is true. Like, I mean, that is actually a thing. And I do actually, as a GM, remind people of that before they come over. Like, bring your slippers. It's cold down here, and it'll be cold until we've been down here for a little bit. So that's definitely, like, that layer can definitely impact where you are in a scene, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, cool. All right, cool. So let's keep going. What is the layer model like? All right, this is all interesting from an academic point of view, right? So it's totally interesting. Like, oh, cool, there's layers, but like, what's really like, what's cool? Like, what can we do with this? Right?
Yeah, absolutely. So what does the layer model do for the GM, Phil?
Right. So GMing is very much about being in those middle layers, right?
Well, middle to bottom. We used to have other layers, but we got rid of
That's
them
right.
because they don't make sense
Game
anymore.
story and campaign,
Yeah.
right? Those are the layers where when we GM, we want to keep our focus. Right?
Yeah, I mean, we will kind of drift into some of those other layers because we play characters, we play NPCs.
Yep, absolutely.
And they can be part of the group at times. So we sometimes get into that layer, but that's not our primary focus.
Yep, and again, we can be distracted by self if we're not, if we're not doing a good job of, taking care of ourselves while we're running a game, right? Like maybe we forgot to bring ourselves some water,
Yes.
right? Like so, but we're trying to stay in those 3 layers because that's where we're gonna help facilitate the game.
In our chat room, Rob Aberzato, the chief, just made a very good point. The layer of self, or like self-awareness, or this sort of meta layer, like it's not part of the game, it's actually a meta layer. Does it include emotional self-awareness? Like preparedness might involve safety tools then too.
Yeah, it's actually a really good point. I mean, at the point when we wrote this, I don't think that was a thing that we were actively thinking through, but absolutely part of self is not only physical self but emotional self, right? So that even includes things like I had a terrible day at work, right? Like that's a thing that you can distract you when you're in a game, right? Like if I had a really crappy day at work and I'm having trouble focusing, which really means I had a crappy day at work and I'm having trouble getting into some of these other layers. And then, like Rob said, preparedness or safety tools are then also a part of that, because when we are worrying about, I shouldn't say worry, when we are being mindful of emotional safety, then safety tools is one of those tools that we bring to the game. So fantastic.
All right. So we were talking about the layer model. We were talking about how for game masters, we're talking specifically about game mastering. The game story and campaign is primary for that. There are the other layers are there too. There's not as in focus, and we know that there's a lot of juggling that occurs.
Yeah, and we can actually, by the way we GM, we can guide people we can guide the group into different layers, right? Like, and that's, I think, where like we're talking about the really like the important part of this is like, how do you use this as a GM? Well, how do you get people into certain layers?
Yeah, absolutely. Like how do we focus on these layers, and how do they benefit us, right?
Absolutely. So like, how would I, Chris, like what can I do as a GM if I want to get people into the character layer?
Sure. So I have 3 things. One is ask personal questions of the characters, not the players, but the characters. That puts us specifically in the character focused layer. When we play NPCs and are interacting with the characters in that space, that also focuses on the character layer. And then when we use in-scene events and actions to prompt characters to make tough choices from their character's point of view, those are all 3 pretty solid ways to get the focus on the character layer.
Right, and I mean, if we're talking about PBTA games, right, always address the character, not the player.
Right.
I
mean, PBTA is a really good way to, if you want to teach a group or get a group to play that way, like I don't know, train is probably the right word. It's practice, right? That game forces you to practice that.
Yeah,
that game style forces you to practice that.
Yeah, incorporates it right into the play style, which is really good.
So you want to tell me about the group?
Yeah. So for the group, the way that we kind of navigate into that layer as a GM is we have the group come up with their own goals, right? What is it you want? What is it you want out of this adventure? What is it you want out of this arc? That kind of thing. And we can do that either in scene, or we can do it at, like kind of almost at the meta layer, just asking those questions. We also can do that by creating threats that focus on the whole group. Right. So if we put the group in danger, then the response that we're hoping for is that the group will react together.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then at the game level.
Oh yes, tell me about the game level layer. They're the same thing.
Yeah. So at the game level, when we want to do that, we need to do things that interact with the game. Right. So setting up a map. Right? Like maybe we don't always use maps in our games, but everybody comes back from the break and you have put a map on the table, right? That's going to
Mhm.
drive people into that layer.
Yep. It's a very different. It shifts the focus to that layer.
Yeah. PBTA does this a lot, right? With and I should say so does Forged in the Dark, where the fiction leads to the move that you want to trigger. So in that case, the narrative is bringing you into the game level because I'm going to set up doing a thing, and then I'm going to go and engage the mechanisms of the game to resolve that.
Hmm.
And then things like clocks. Clocks are great, right? Clocks are an awesome tool for creating tension. Clocks, because they are things on the table, will also drag people into the game layer, right? Because now when they're looking at the clock, they're like, well, there's 4 more ticks left on that clock. And if, the GM rolls this, or if I roll this, I can push a tick, I can take a tick off, that kind of thing. That's game layer thinking, right?
Yeah, and really, it's any mechanisms. Clocks are a great example, right? But like
Oh, yeah.
The Jenga tower is one of them.
Sure.
Anything that counts down is a thing that works that way.
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
candles and 10 candles.
yeah, and it's actually interesting because Starcross is a game that very interestingly forces players to deal with the game layer and the character layer with very quick switching back and forth. There's a lot of switching back and forth when you are playing Starcross, because you cannot ever not think about the tower, right? Because and Alex is brilliant in this, right? Because if you didn't have to touch the tower to talk, you could fall into the character layer pretty easily and not have to worry about the game, right? Because you would just sit there and look at the character and have a moment. But the fact that Alex requires in her design requires you to touch the tower, you are constantly reminded of the game while you're at the character layer, right? Like
Mhm.
that's it's a really insidious part of the design, because you have to concentrate at the character layer, but you are constantly being distracted by the game layer, which creates tension, which is what that game's all about, is tension,
Yeah,
right? So
let me tell you, Alex Roberts and her design, like for the Queen, the deck is getting smaller. I
yes,
feel like if you're going to play that game online, like on Roll20 or something, and they had like a Roll20 deck. I don't know if they do yet. I'm sure they do
I think
somewhere
they do.
probably. You would have to have a number of cards left in the deck,
Yeah,
like
to count
number
down. Yeah,
to count down to see it, because that is part of what creates the tension of that game.
yeah. I mean, you start getting, it's getting lower and lower, and the discard deck's getting bigger and bigger. Yeah,
So like
absolutely.
Alex Roberts' design is very solid in that like that idea. She carries it through quite well.
Yep. Tell me about story. How do we get players into the story layer?
Sure. So sourcing the table is a great way to do that. And what I mean is not asking
Mhm.
necessarily from the character level, or not asking from the character level, but asking at the player level. Like, would you please define something inside of this bar? Would you tell me about this NPC that you met? Would you give me some details about them? How do they talk? Like that, you're letting them define things in the setting, and that's also asking players to contribute to the world. They're the same kind of idea. It's a little bit more specific when you're contributing to the world. Sourcing the table is more of a generalized idea. You
Yeah.
can create choice points so that you can let the players choose where the story goes. That's a
Hmm.
thing that you can do. And as a game master, presenting a bunch of hooks and ideas for the players to engage with, so that they have choices in how the story flows forward, is a great technique to use at the story level as a game master.
Yeah, and absolutely, like anything where scene setting is,
Yep, scene setting. Yep.
like if players are responsible for scene setting, that absolutely pushes you into a story place.
Yeah.
I want to quickly
Or even
address.
part of the scene setting. If it's like collaborative scene setting, like, hey everybody,
Yeah,
let's figure out what this tavern looks like together.
yeah. Look, I just want to address really quick. The Weregator Eric Bonts asked a question about, do safety tools allow you to deal with an issue without being ejected to the personal layer, or do they incorporate the personal layer into them? I think that safety tools always bring you back, and I think they should, right? I think they should bring you back to a personal layer, because you should never play through any kind of safety issue. So,
Hmm.
if somebody touches an X card, you should always like come back to the personal layer and have that check-in, right? And then go back. If anything, what it does is it creates a touchstone to let everyone else know, hey, I need you to come back to the personal layer for a second because there's something I'm uncomfortable with.
Yep.
Right. Like, so I think I think its actual purpose, the safety tool should always be, it should always be centered on the person. So open door is a thing where you are acknowledging, like, I need to get up and walk away. Lines and veils, right, are definitely kick in. Lines and veils are interesting because lines and veils can kick in also at the story level, right? Because lines and veils create our boundaries for where we tell stories.
It's true.
But X-Card absolutely brings you back to X-Card script change and things like that absolutely bring you back to the personal layer and have you check in.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're depending on the tool, they sort of serve different functions, but they all definitely go back to the personal layer. I'm thinking about script change can be a little different because it's about editing scenes a lot of times. So
script change heads into the story layer too, right? Because one, it pulls you back to the personal layer because you're like, well, pause, right? Oh, okay, let's all stop for a second. Why did we pause? But then what the cool part with script change is, script change acknowledges we're going to need to fix up the story here. So, hey, how about we rewind?
Yep, so let's rewind it because we didn't like how that went. Or we can fast forward when we decided that we think the scene's over, right? Like, and it doesn't just necessarily, I mean, it's a great safety tool. It's also an editing tool for the story layer.
Yeah,
because
actually,
we're like, the scene's over, right? Like, we don't need to do this anymore. I want to fast forward through the rest of it.
Right. If the X card is like a circuit breaker, right? Like hitting the X card, like, throws you to the personal layer and kind of stops all the other layers. The cool part about script change is that script change actually facilitates going back in.
Yeah, I mean, script change has the X card in it with the pause button,
right?
But it also has a veil button in it with the fast forward.
Yeah, and it facilitates because it acknowledges the story again, right? So it says like, oh, you know what? Now that we've talked and we're sure that we're okay and we're ready to resume gaming, let's get back into the story layer. Which way do we want to get back in? Do we want to rewind and then proceed forward, or do we want to skip over and keep going?
Yeah, or if somebody's just unsure, they have step by step, which means you can just that's like let's put the brakes on this and let's be cautious about how we're proceeding forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a really, really cool tool.
Yeah, very cool, excellent. And then I think we lastly have to talk about the campaign layer. And just because I'm minding our time, we should. I'll do this very quickly so we can start talking about arcs. But at the campaign layer, we can engage players into thinking about the campaign by creating those branch points, right? So if we do a campaign with some kind of branching story, then we let the players kind of put themselves into those branch points and decide where it's going to go. If we're doing sandbox, we could open up new areas for them to explore. You know, a new sector has been found, in a space game, something like that. And then, just the creation of new arcs, or even asking players like, hey, like, we have room for a personal arc. What would you like to get into with your character coming up, right? And we're going to talk about arcs in just a moment, but, asking a player, like, what kind of arc would you like to have for your character as we get going? Is absolutely a campaign thing. Like, oh, I think during the course of this campaign, I really would like to resolve the issues, with my warlord father. Like, oh, cool, yeah, that's great. Let's do that, right?
Let's put the warlord father in the next arc then.
Exactly. Yeah.
So let's talk about blending real quick. So originally, like, we called these things layers to help separate them from each other, to more easily understand what they were doing and help us make sense of how they work. I think River said that, name a thing and you have power over it, right?
It's a thing I firmly believe in for a long time.
Absolutely. But I mean, it's been years since we did that topic. I really think that these things are more like a bunch of overlapping Venn diagram circles, because I think each layer influences and crosses over with each other one.
Yeah, they're very. I as we've kind of evolved this thought, like foci was the other word that I used. They're like places where our minds kind of focus, and then they draw out and draw to other places and focus over here and a focus over there kind of thing. But yeah,
Mhm.
I don't think they're very they're not rigid,
No,
right?
not
Like
at all.
they're not rigid, and it's possible to exist in the in between pieces. And I think the other thing that we basically said early on after we kind of picked apart our original design was like they all can connect to each other. Like you can get from character to personal and personal to campaign. Like they like you're floating to each of them. There's not a pathway, right? You're not going like,
Mhm.
well, I have to go from character to to story to game, that kind of thing. Like
Yeah,
you
and they
just go
all
from one to the other.
the more comfortable you are with the game that you're playing and the people that you're playing with, the more that that moving between them disappears.
Yeah, I don't know if it disappears, but it becomes more. It becomes. I think you become less aware of it. Like it
Yeah,
just happens,
that's what I mean by disappears. It just sort of happens, like you do
right?
it naturally.
And if you want a good example of that, the first time you play a new game, you're constantly jarred into the game layer, right? But as you gain mastery, like you've played multiple sessions of it, that part becomes so much smoother that you traverse it very quickly,
Hmm.
and then you're back out. But when you first learn a game, you're flipping through the book and you're, oh, wait, how's that done? What is it on a tie? All of those things keep, like drive us into that layer.
Well, let me also throw it to you from a group perspective. Like when you play with the same people or people that you're really comfortable with over the course of time,
Hmm.
um, that that going from story to character, like layers and levels and play, is much more fluid
Yeah, absolutely.
because y'all know each other, so y'all know your tendencies. Sometimes you can get around a lot of things where you just sort of understand a lot of things about each other,
Yeah,
and it makes it smoother. Like you're talking about, it's the same deal with the rule book.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other one, if you really want to see how, how one
Let
of
me
these
just
things,
say, the latency goes down, right?
yes.
Thank you,
Um,
Eric, the Weregator.
the other example, if you really want to see how a layer can um, dominate your attention, like go play with wet socks. Like you will never be able to focus on any other layer, right? Like
uh,
so, in wintertime you accidentally step in the little puddle of water taking off your
it's the
boots,
worst.
like you will know, right? Like you will know all game that your sock is wet. Okay.
Okay,
Um, cool.
that's
All
one.
right. So that was one of the things we wanted to talk about because it's kind of it's a thing that we like we played around with and talk about. And we actually we use it kind of in our normal podcasting. But another one that we use quite a bit is arcs, and this is from Arc of the Misdirected. Right, is the name of the episode.
Yeah, episode 241. So why don't you hit me with some definitions and terminology?
Right.
Definition
So
Panda.
right. So we need to kind of understand the difference in a couple different things, right? So story, and now let me be clear. These are terms we use and that we've
Yes.
established. These are not. I don't think there's any industry standard for any of these, but these are the
No.
ones that we like, and actually you can find them in Hydra Hackers because we used these terms in Hydra Hackers as how we defined parts of the game. So story is the beginning, middle, and end to the play of the game, right? It is bigger than a session. It can be bigger than a session. It
Yeah,
can
it could
be
be,
one session, or it can be multiple sessions.
or it could
Um,
be a bunch of stories inside of a single session.
right? Yeah. You could go super small and have a bunch of stories inside of a single session, especially if you were doing like personal stories.
Also,
Um,
if you were playing a session that was 12 hours long.
oh yeah, oof. Not since I was in sixth grade.
Yep, I
Um,
hear you.
so anyway, I think what's probably easier is let me first describe. Let me go back and describe session. Session is from the time that we sit down and play to the time that we get up and stop the game. So that's a session. So whether you sit down and you're playing a 4 hour session, whether you're playing a 2 hour session, whether you're going like the marathon 12, that's session. And then
Mhm.
story is the thing that we do in the game, right? Like we play a story, and we're in the most traditional sense saying that stories have a beginning, middle, and end. Okay.
Yes.
And that's the relationship between the two of those, right? They're not the same thing. Okay. Um, and so right, so we'll get into arcs, and well, I guess we're going to get into arcs right now, right?
Yeah, let me talk about arcs. So
Yeah.
an arc is a set of related stories that, when put together, tell their own larger narrative and also have a narrative structure of beginning, middle, and end.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
It's smart to use the idea of narrative when we're talking about this instead of story, since we already use story for something else.
Right.
I think the important thing about an arc, this related idea, is having some sort of connectivity between the elements in your arc, these different narratives that you're telling, and it's this narrative that you're telling, these different stories that you're telling. It's some sort of unity of effect. It's a through line that creates grounding. Often the characters can be enough for that. Hence, like the Conan stories, like that. It's just his life, right? But Conan's the central figure through all that, plus the idea of civilization versus barbarism. Not barbarism versus nature versus whatever you want to. There's
Yeah.
a word for it, but like plot lines, themes, threats. Those are all things that can connect a narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And then a campaign is one or more arcs played together. And this is so now we're like this is a fractal thing, right? So we're going from story, and then we have connected stories make an arc, connected arcs make a campaign.
Yep.
And in the simplest term, a short campaign is one arc.
Yep.
Right, a beginning, middle, and end. And a longer campaign is more than one arc. Right, there's no other measurement beyond that. Right, there's just simply a short campaign or not a short campaign.
Yeah, pretty much. That's how that goes.
Right.
So let's talk about the structures of arcs now. So arcs, they have a variety of possible setups, but the most common one and the one that we can all very readily identify with is the 3-act format. Phil, would you tell us about the 3-act format?
Yeah, right. So the 3-act format, right? This is our 7th grade. This is 7th grade English class for those of you in the States. Act 1 is our setup and introduction. Our inciting incident occurs sometimes here. Or actually, I should say our inciting incident always occurs here. Act 2 is our conflict, our rising action, right? Our big bad rising action.
Mm-hmm.
My nickname in college.
Big bad rising action.
That's right. Or it could be tri-fail cycles, complications. Like there's a couple different, like the simplest, of course, is the traditional rising action, but there are different ways to do that. And that all leads to Act 3, which is the reveal, the twist, the raising of stakes, and the final showdown, right? Both the climax and the denouement, right, is all part of Act 3.
And we're going to break all that down a little bit later.
Yep.
All right, let's talk about the focus of arcs now.
Yeah, so an arc can be focused on the entire group, right? So that's like a meta arc.
Yep.
So like the fall of the Empire in the original Star Wars trilogy, right? Like
correct.
Over the course of those three movies, right? We see the fall of the Empire. That's a big arc.
That is a very big arc. Yep. Also, arcs can be for an individual character. A character arc, for example, Luke's father and his destiny in that story. This original Star Wars trilogy.
Yeah, like what Vader, the revelations, and then finally, ultimately, his momentary redemption.
Mm-hmm.
Arcs can be continuous and non-continuous.
Yes.
Right? So if a continuous arc is one that we keep playing session after session, right? Every session that we play, the stories that we're playing in advance that arc forward.
Yeah. Arcs can also be played in non-consecutive sessions with other things happening in between.
Yeah, I mean, I will always go back to X-Files as being one of the easiest examples of.
I wrote your X-Files example in later too.
Yeah, see, exactly, right? Like X-Files is like the perfect example of how to do non-consecutive arcs.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Multiple arcs can be threaded together non-consecutively to actually start making very complex story structures.
Yes.
And there's like a couple of different ways we can think about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can take a story arc,
yep,
and mix it with some character arcs.
Yes, and it's even better if you can have some of the things in the character arcs, the threats and whatnot, and the elements be similar or the same as the ones in the story arc.
Yep.
Yeah, we can have several different story arcs mixed together. Like I have that going on right now in a couple of games that I'm running.
Yeah, and several story arcs mixed together with character arcs, right? So like now, like we can just go back to Empire Strikes Back because Empire Strikes Back does this like really well.
Yeah, this is probably the most complex one to do because you're weaving a bunch of different stories together.
Yep.
A bunch of different narratives together, probably. That's better. A bunch of different arcs together. So like there's we mentioned Luke's father and Luke's destiny. That's one.
Yep.
There's the Han Solo and the Jabba the Hutt story that's going on in that too.
Absolutely. We have Han Solo and Leia's love story.
Yep, there's that story that's also going in that arc.
And then like overall we've got, the war between the rebellion and the Empire.
Yep, and that's the meta arc for all of it.
And all of that's going on in some form through all three movies, and each one, if you plot them, each one kind of peaks at different points and like has their own climaxes. Like Jabba's arc ends by the first third of Jedi, right? Like that arc with Han Solo and Jabba resolves.
Yeah, but it starts right away.
Right, it starts right at it starts almost at the beginning of Star Wars,
Mhm.
right? But we like Han Solo and Leia's love story actually waits till almost the absolute end of Jedi
Yep, that's
before
true.
it resolves,
Hmm.
right? In fact, it actually resolves after the main meta arc of the war between the Rebellion and Empire.
Yeah, it is part of the denouement.
Yeah, it's part of the denouement um, of the meta arc. Yeah, so it, like again, what we're getting at here is when you mix these arcs together and you intersperse them, your stories become more complex, and complex not in a bad way, but complex in that they become very rich.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, and they're yeah, exactly what you said. I don't have to say anymore. Let's talk about the length of arcs. So an arc has to be more than one story.
Otherwise, it's a story.
Yeah, otherwise it's just a story.
Right. And there's really no upper limit, right? An arc can have as many stories as you need to have a beginning, middle, and end, as
Yep.
long as you've got that connective material that identifies that each of these stories is connected together to make this arc.
Here, let me hit you with an example that you'll probably all recognize and understand. There are essentially 2 arcs, maybe 3 arcs in the Harry Potter books and the Harry Potter movies. There's the arc where it's Voldemort's return, and then there's the arc with the war against Voldemort.
Mhm.
And they each have a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah.
And then there's some connecting material in there, and they each have more than one story because there's what 4 books, 4 books before we get Voldemort back, and then there's 3 books after we get Voldemort back. Those are all stories.
Yeah, and the thing that's really interesting to kind of play off of that for a second is that the feel of a campaign can change as certain arcs open and close, right?
Yes.
So there's a very distinct difference between that first arc of Voldemort coming back and then the second arc of the battle.
Yeah,
right?
because as soon as Voldemort comes back, you kill Cedric Diggory.
Right,
And
and
change
that's
the entire tone of everything.
absolutely right. Like everything that happens after that is absolutely affected by the end of that arc.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's actually something in terms of campaign management. I'm going completely off script here if you're okay.
Yeah, that's
Um,
fine. I just went off script too, so I thought it was a good example. So.
So in terms of campaign management, this is actually a really important thing. When you close out an arc and open a new one, your game is probably in its most precarious state since it's first started.
Yes.
Right? Because when you have closed when you've closed an arc, you have taken away something very familiar, right? So all the tone, the theme, the story, and everything that the players have been used to up to this point has now stopped. And now you are starting a new one. And if everything goes well, the new one will take, right? And everyone will be excited and the game will progress. But if that arc winds up for any reason not being as engaging as the first arc, your campaign will like suddenly have like a falter, right? And so there's really the transition of arcs. And now that we're talking about this, I'm really starting to think about a Gnome Stew article or an episode that we need to do about this. But that transition of arcs, and how do you like what do you have to do to put a little extra effort in to make sure that your transition closing out one arc into the next one is going to be successful, right? Because there are a lot of people who are Harry Potter fans who have a very strong preference for one half, like one of the arcs or the other. Like I am very much, I like the first setup, like the first arc.
Mhm.
And then I find the second one to be like a bit darker.
It is darker.
It is darker, right? Like, but I like the earlier one. Like I like that first
Sure.
arc.
It's whimsical, right? It's fantastical, whimsical.
And people will tell you that too. Like people know, like, oh, when Cedric dies, like everything changes.
So I think a good tip for that is you need to have some stuff left over from your first arc that isn't quite closed out yet, because to build off of, you need elements
Yeah.
to build off of, things going on in the background that haven't been resolved, or that were like the wild cards. There's an idea of the wild card out there that becomes the enemy. So like your wild card is doing stuff. Your wild, and by wild card I mean like you're not necessarily wrapped up in what's going on, but could go either way depending on what happens.
Right.
Uh, or
I think
maybe it just doesn't do anything. They become a bigger problem later, or whatever plot threads you have left over.
I also think this is an important place where having those other arcs, the character arcs, are really important, because sometimes we get into a thing where, as we're concluding the big meta arc, we are also starting to conclude all of the personal arcs. And then what we wind up with is this really clean break between the end of the first arc and the beginning of the next arc. Whereas if we don't do that, we don't resolve some of those personal arcs, they will help carry the game as the next arc takes off. Like, for instance, Hermione and Ron, right? Like, that's an arc that kind of starts before before Cedric dies, but it persists through, and keeps going.
Mm-hmm.
And that's helpful, right? That's connective tissue, right? Like, that's the character connective tissue that keeps the characters rooted in the game as the other things around them change. Oh, this is fun. This off script thing is good.
Right. Absolutely. No, it's a good point. Like that is one of the things I was going to say the characters are your primary touchstone.
Right. So character arcs are the best way to keep that going, right?
Absolutely. And once you've had your first arc, they've had some time to develop and have their own things going on. So it's easier to build off of those character arcs moving forward. So you want to talk about what goes into a good arc? We got probably about 7 minutes left.
Yeah. So things that go into good arcs, right? Or introduction to orientation, right? Give characters time to get a feel for who they are and introduce the main threat, right? The inciting incident.
It's less important after the first arc to let characters get a feel for who they are, because we already know who they are. But introducing,
I will argue, unless of course there's been like a dramatic level change or something like that, then you should have a brief
shift
version of this. Yeah.
Yeah, that is true. The threat, the arc should be about some person or event that poses some kind of harm to the world, or the setting, I should say. The setting is probably a better word there.
Yep. Rising action, try fail cycles, right? We need something to happen that progresses forward and starts gradually raising stakes.
Mm-hmm. And the fail part is always hard to do in role playing games, because we don't like our characters to always fail.
Yeah, I mean, wow, we could do a whole thing on best fails, right? Like
right.
fail best.
Then we have the climax, which is the pivotal scene or scenes where the threat is directly confronted.
Yep. And then we move into our conclusion, aftermath, denouement, like all the things that start the falling action portion. The fallout from the climax, what happens, how do we wrap up those things that were taking place during this arc that we now want to start closing off.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I would like to say that I think a technique is that this whole thing that we just talked about is fractal and can be used on a smaller scale repeatedly during an arc. It's how a GM has their smaller stories inside of the arc. Yeah, so
it's really one of those things that, like, a story has essentially the same structure as an arc on a bigger scale, and a campaign has essentially the same structure as an arc on a bigger scale,
because they're all narratives.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I will also put forth the opinion that I think that stronger arcs often have some kind of connective material, a theming, a tone, something that ties all of that stuff together. That unity of effect. Just go check out Edgar Allan Poe's Unity of Effect. You'll get what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be that dramatically connected, because Poe would tell you that everything has to be, every word, every sentence has to be tied together. We're not Edgar Allan Poe.
No, and in some ways this is kind of a thing where, especially if we're talking about PBTA games, if we're following the principles of the game, we're likely creating this connective material, or this, I should say, this not connective material, but this effect, right? Because if we're holding true to the principles of the game, then that in itself becomes some of that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea is really important because if you want to have non-related stories that make sense in your campaign play, in your play of this narrative that you're putting together, then having that connective material really helps tie it to the ongoing thing that you're doing. So it doesn't feel like this weird out of left field story that's being told.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why I think like when you go back to the X-Files, um, all of the um, all of the uh, Monster of the Week episodes of X-Files still have the same kind of tone and feel. Like occasionally not, but often the creepy, weird, either supernatural, super science, um, kind of event.
Well,
That
they're all also part of the X Files, which is the
yeah,
core conceit of the show, which would be in a group template game. Like, well, you're all members of this organization, and these are the things that this organization deals with.
yeah, and actually the characters then also know what role they fill in it, right? So Mulder is intensely curious about solving this, and Scully is like, yeah, but is it really what you think it is? That kind of like whether they're in the big arc or whether they're in one of these non-related stories, they still play out those roles.
Yep, which is
And
familiar and comforting.
right, and the other thing I will say about using non-related stories, so disconnected arcs, is that um, it, those things are great if you are trying to make things longer. So if you are running, like for instance, if you're running in the Gauntlet where you tend to run smaller arcs where you are, we're going to play for 4 or 5 sessions, we're going to commit to 4 or 5 sessions and play this story through, then actually you don't want too many non-related anything, right? You want to kind of just stay on the arc and play through. If you're running your home game, and you're thinking to yourself like I would like ideally I'd like to get this game for like going out for a half year, then or more or whatever. I never think beyond that, but like if if well I don't I mean past a few months I consider it a success. But what these non-related stories do is they create spacers, right? Because one of the things when we talk about pacing is that if all of your stories are progressing you through the beginning, middle, and end, then you are getting that much closer to the end every time you play. But if you throw non-related stories in, then you are playing, but you are actually you're actually freezing an arc temporarily, playing something and then returning to it.
Yes, it also creates a meta beat structure for your play.
Yeah.
Which is really useful.
Yeah, so non-related stories are fantastic. Like I used to run Conspiracy X, which was basically like X-Files, the role-playing game, and I hugged that X-Files model like so tightly. Like I did Monster of the Week and I did arcs, and like it's the perfect kind of way to make a game feel like it's the same game every session without burning out arcs. Because one of the cool things about a good story arc is like the time it takes to build up. One of the things I think everyone, like if you ever went and just binged the X-Files and only watched the meta arc episodes, right? Then it's less satisfying than having waited all through the season and then all of a sudden one of these episodes appears, right? like there's an anticipation that you get from that, and that's what these spacers can do, is they create anticipation. Like yes, we're doing this thing, but I know the other thing is coming, right?
Yeah,
Like
yes, I mean sometimes it's both ways, right? Like the X-Files were like a disjointed number of non-consecutive episodes compared to ones that were part of the mythology arc. Yeah, but like other kinds of storytelling have more things that are in the serialized arc, and then fewer episodes or fewer stories, I should say, that are part of the outside of that.
Yep.
I mean, depends on what your preference is.
The other cool thing about
you have that choice.
Exactly. One more thing about these non-consecutive episodes, and then we should get ready to wrap up. Is the other thing it lets you do is it lets you experiment with different structures, different tone, different characters. Like by pulling yourself out of the main arc where continuity is really important, right? Because you need that connective tissue in an arc. Pulling yourself out into a single standalone story lets you change things up because you're going to be done with it and go back to the arc. And that's why as much fun as, and again, I'm just harp back to the X-Files one more time, as much fun as the meta arc to X-Files is, some of the best X-Files episodes are those individual Monster of the Week ones because they were places where the writers had more freedom to do stuff. And you will too as a GM.
Now, we talked a lot about TV and movies and things like that when we were in books when we were talking about this, but honestly, you can go and this stuff really relates to the tabletop role-playing game. You just go and listen to any AP. Like right now I'm listening to Skyjacks, and they get into a lot of this kind of stuff. Like
Absolutely.
they're using a lot of this arc storytelling type ideas in their play. They're not talking about it that way, obviously, because they're doing that, but like you can listen to pretty much any that AP that kind of goes on for a very long time. The Redemption podcast, the same thing. Like they all have this arc kind of play that sounds a lot like what we're talking about.
Sometimes on the show we talk about how
Friends
literary,
at the table, that too.
Yep. Sometimes we talk about on the show how literary things don't often translate directly into games. This would be the opposite. This is one of those ones that directly translates and works really well.
Yeah, you can really break down how stories work and then utilize that for like your beat structure for like, well, we've done this like four stories in a row. Maybe we should do one outside of this just to get a different feel.
Yeah, and I mean the truth is you can do this with you can do this very sophisticated, or you can do this like 7th grade English style, and it still works.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, cool.
All
We're
right,
down to 3 minutes.
We're
down to 3 minutes. We should get ready to wrap up and thank everyone and tell people where they can find us. So, Chris, where do people find you on the internet?
At the Light 101 on Twitter. That's probably one of the best places to get me, or really Tuesday evenings on twitch.tv/misdirected Mark from 8 p.m. until around 10 p.m. That's where I am.
Yep, you can find me at DNA Phil. And same thing, you can find me on Twitch doing the Misdirected Mark show. You can find all the other Misdirected Mark podcasts at misdirectedmark.com. So all of the other ones that we do down with D&D, Pandas, and the ones that we don't do.
Everything we said.
Yeah, everything else we said. And then you can find the stuff that we write on Gnome Stew, and you can find the stuff that we make by going to Drive-Thru or Itch. We have stuff on Itch as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not everything, but our smaller stuff is on Itch, and all of our stuff's on Drive-Thru. That's us, right?
Designs.com. There's your jingle. Does anybody have a question with 2 minutes left? 2 minutes. 2 minutes. I don't know. Do you have a question, Phil?
I don't think I have a question.
We talk all the time, so I mean, who knows? Panda's Talking Games was Panda's Talking Games got a heart. There you go.
Hey,
that's always good.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody that came out and hung out with us tonight.
Yeah, have an awesome Gauntlet. Have an awesome Gauntlet Con.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us here. Oh yeah, there's also a lot of good stuff on Gnome Stew. Thank you, Jared.
There are many great reviews on Gnome Stew, thanks to Jared Rasher.
The review gnome.
Yes,
and also writes a lot of other interesting things.
I'm bad at reviews. That's not a strong point for me.
Well, I guess that's it then. I mean, we could fill time for a minute and a half, but I really don't think we should.
No, I think we're good. Do you have a button that ends us, or
no? I don't. But I'm pretty sure Rich
I think Rich comes back and finds us.
Rich is here. I'm pretty sure he's like monitoring the show somewhere around us. But I guess I should say a mic drop.
We out. That's how we do it on the other show.
Punch the mic.
No, that's awkward. I'm gonna hit myself.
I'll punch